Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. This video is going to talk about Bernard Suit's analysis of playing games. So in the video, we're going to start out by giving you a little bit of background context since the part we read actually starts at chapter 3. Then after we give that context, then we're going to talk about how he starts out by discussing a distinction between playing games and work, and how that leads to a discussion of rules, means, and goals, and the roles that these play in understanding games. And then we'll look at Suits' actual definition. And he gives a fully fleshed out version of this definition, but then towards the end, to try to make it a little bit more memorable, a little bit easier, a little bit more compact, he gives what he calls the portable definition, which we'll also discuss a little bit. And then we'll look at some examples just to see how this works when applied to actual games that we're familiar with. So, for a little bit of background context here, Suits' book is a dialogue with this main character of the grasshopper. And this grasshopper is supposed to be the same character, the same grasshopper from Aesop's fables known as the grasshopper and the ant. If you're unfamiliar with that fable, you can read one version here at this link, or you can just Google the grasshopper and the ant, and you can find lots of different versions. The main idea of this fable is that over the course of a summer, there's a grasshopper who's enjoying the sun, and an ant comes by carrying this big piece of food, and the grasshopper's like, oh, that looks like a lot of hard work. Why don't you take a break, enjoy the sun, play, enjoy the day? The ant says, no, I need to work. I need to get this food ready for winter. And the grasshopper's like, but winter's so far away. You need to enjoy life. You need to play. Values are different. And then this keeps happening over and over during the summer. Finally, winter comes. The grasshopper has no food, is getting cold, sees the ant with their food and fire, asks if they can partake, and the ant refuses. And it's implied that, well, the grasshopper's not going to survive the winter because they didn't prepare. They were too busy playing and enjoying themselves during the summer without any kind of planning. But to give a little bit of context here, this is the same grasshopper in this dialogue. And to some extent, Bernard Suits' book here could be seen at least as a partial defense of the grasshopper and the grasshopper's values. So before chapter 3, the part we've read, the book started out with the grasshopper meeting with his pupils at the end of the summer. So this grasshopper is supposedly like a sage for other grasshoppers they look up to as a source of wisdom. And the grasshopper explains to his pupils that playing rather than working, those are the values, those are the principles of the life of a grasshopper. The grasshopper claims that those principles of valuing play over work, the fact that there are winters, prevents people from seeing that this is what's truly valuable and how we ought to live our lives. Moreover, he says these principles are so important to him that it makes sense for him to die for the value of these principles. And so the grasshopper then goes on to explain a strange dream that he had. He was looking around and everybody was actually playing games without realizing it. The politician, the scientist, etc. They were all playing games, but they didn't realize it. And then when the grasshopper revealed to them that they were playing games, people just vanished into thin air. And the grasshopper's like, I don't know how to make sense of this dream. And then the grasshopper dies, leaving his pupils to try to make sense of that dream. And now one of the pupils mentions that he had a very long conversation about playing games over the summer with the grasshopper. And so now they say, okay, well, let's try to recount that conversation. Maybe that'll help us discover and interpret what that dream is supposed to mean. And then this leads into where we started our reading, where we see that recollection of those past conversations about games. And so it starts out actually by saying, well, let us start with the commonplace belief that playing games is different from working. The idea is, methodologically, we should start with ideas that are obvious and common sense and move to more complicated ideas later. One thing that seems common sense and obvious to pretty much everybody is that there's a very big difference. There's an opposition between working and playing games. And so if we have an idea of what working is, and we know that playing games is like the opposite of that, well, that might give us a clue into how to understand what it is to play games. And then the grasshopper goes on and says, well, let us now baldly characterize work as technical activity, by which I mean activity in which an agent seeks to employ the most efficient available means for reaching a desired goal. So you see this phrase a lot, the means to the end. The end is the goal you're trying to achieve. The means is the way you try to achieve that goal, the path you take to that goal. Imagine someone is working to cure cancer. The goal is to cure cancer. The fact that they do experiments, the fact that they go into a scientific lab and they collaborate with others, they read research papers, those are the means. That's the way that they're trying to learn how to cure cancer. So the claim here is that what makes this work is that when that scientist is trying to cure cancer, they're doing the best to try to take the most efficient path to getting to that goal. If this is what it means to work, to have some goal and to try to find the most efficient way to achieve that goal, then this might give us a clue into what games are, since playing games is supposed to be opposed to working. So since both work and games have goals, the possibility suggests itself that games differ from technical activities. They're different than work in that the means employed in games are not the most efficient. So what makes something work is that when you're trying to achieve your goal, you're trying to figure out the most efficient way to do so. When you're playing a game, you're trying to achieve a goal, but you're not trying to do it in the most efficient way possible. You're trying to do it by less efficient ways. Now, Suits suggests that this is on the right track when we think about certain kinds of examples. Imagine you have the goal of getting a small ball into a hole in the ground. If I was trying to do that, if I was trying to accomplish that goal by the most effective way possible, well, I would just pick up the ball, walk over to the hole, and drop it in. That seems like the most efficient way to achieve that goal. One thing that wouldn't be very efficient is grabbing a big metal club, walking super far away from the hole, and then trying to smack the ball into the hole from far away. That would be much less efficient for accomplishing that goal. But isn't that what people do in golf? And so it looks like in playing this game, looks like people are taking a less efficient way to achieve this goal. Maybe that's why these people are playing a game as opposed to working. But Suits doesn't think that this can be quite right yet. It hasn't gotten us to a full understanding of games. And he gives some examples to raise an objection here. He says, well, the goal in playing poker is to win poker. But notice, you can play poker well and you can play it poorly. When you play in it well, you are using the more efficient ways to win poker. When you play it poorly, when you make bad choices, you are using less efficient ways of accomplishing that goal of winning poker. And so when I play poker, I still might be trying to make the best decisions I can to make it more likely that I'm going to win. I want to make the best choices so I can more efficiently achieve this goal of winning the game using the most efficient ways that are made available to me by the rules of poker. I don't want to make bad choices and bet on hands that aren't very good. That would not be a very efficient way to achieve the goal of winning poker. Similarly, Suits points out, well, the goal in golf is not actually just to get the ball into a hole in the ground. Really, what golfers are trying to do is to get a ball in the hole by hitting the ball with a club from a far distance. Their goal is to get the ball in the hole in a particular way. And so hitting a ball with a metal club is not actually a less efficient way to achieve this goal. When you pick up a ball and carry it with your hands, that actually prevents you from achieving your goal of getting the ball into the hole in a particular way. If the goal is not just to get the ball in the hole, but it's to get the ball in a particular way using a club, notice there are more and less efficient ways of hitting a golf ball with a metal club to get it into the ground. Using this metal club to hit the ball in the direction of the hole is surely much more efficient than standing in the opposite direction and hitting the ball in the opposite direction of the hole. And when I try to play golf, I still try to use the most effective means within the rules of golf. And so it looks like we don't have a distinction between work and playing games yet. In work, you're trying to use the most efficient ways to achieve a goal. And now in games, when we understand the goals of those games correctly, we're also trying to use the most efficient ways within the rules to achieve that goal. But Suits thinks the previous objections also helps illuminate something really important about the nature of games and how they work. He says the rules in games seem to stand in a peculiar relation to ends. So games have certain kinds of rules, and he thinks there's a very intimate relationship between the goal of a game and the rules of the game. He says the end in poker is not simply to gain money, or in golf simply to get a ball into a hole, but to do these things in prescribed ways. So your goal is to achieve this thing in a very particular way. And the rules in games tell you the ways that you are able to achieve that goal and the ways you're not able to. And so your goal is not just to accomplish this thing, but to accomplish it while following the rules that are set by the game. So rules in games thus seem to be in some sense inseparable from ends. For to break a game rule is to render impossible the attainment of an end. The idea is if your goal is to gain money by following the rules of poker, then when you break the rules of poker, you thereby undermine your ability to accomplish this goal in this way. On Suits' account, this is part of what distinguishes playing games from work. It's this idea that you don't just have a goal without caring about the means you use to get that goal. In fact, the means to accomplishing some goal is actually part of the goal itself. We might describe this as games incorporate the means into the ends. That's what the rules do. However, Suits doesn't think that merely incorporating the means into the goal itself is sufficient to turn it into a game. And we can see this by considering a couple examples. So firstly, he gives an original example involving a character he calls Professor Snooze. This is an imaginary example, but he says, imagine you're on campus and across the field, you see Professor Snooze napping underneath a bush. And you realize that that bush is actually a man-eating plant and it's about to try to eat Professor Snooze. Your goal is to save Professor Snooze. You start running towards Professor Snooze and then you notice a sign that says, keep off of the grass. So there's a rule that says don't go on the grass, but you just don't even think about it. You just keep running and go right across the grass. Clearly you're not playing a game. And we look at this idea of games as incorporating the means into the ends. Suits' discussion so far would give the right result and say that this is not a game. Because notice, your goal is not to save Professor Snooze by staying on the path. Your goal is just to save Professor Snooze. You're trying to do so in the most efficient way possible. You could take the less efficient way of following the path and not going on the grass, but you just don't care. His life is more valuable than that, and so you cut across the grass and save his life. But then Suit says, let's imagine a very strange case, where instead of just having the goal of saving Professor Snooze, and you're willing to take any means that you might need to that are efficient for doing so. Imagine you say, you know what, I'm going to set myself the goal of saving Professor Snooze, but not just to save him. My goal is to save him by running around the path and not using the grass because I want a challenge. Now it looks like I am playing a game. I've created a game for myself. I've thereby said, I'm not going to take the most efficient means. My goal is to accomplish saving Professor Snooze using this less efficient path, not going on the grass. Clearly, someone probably shouldn't play games like that. It's more important just to save Professor Snooze's life. But it looks like if you were to do that, you would be playing a game, even though you shouldn't be. Now imagine that the means that you restrict yourself from using are not just trivial, like don't cut across the grass. Imagine there's some moral importance behind those means that you say you won't use. So imagine that instead of there being a man-eating plant, imagine there's another person, call them Dr. Threat, and it's clear that Dr. Threat is about to try to murder Professor Snooze. You want to save Professor Snooze, but imagine you are committed to this moral idea that it's always wrong to kill a person no matter what. Now, maybe you agree with that idea, maybe you don't. But let's just imagine that somebody thought it was immoral always to kill anybody, regardless of the circumstances. Well, now you can imagine the person saying, look, I'm going to try to save Professor Snooze without killing Dr. Threat. So now they've incorporated the means by which they might save Professor Snooze into their goal. Their goal is no longer just to save Professor Snooze. Their goal is to save Professor Snooze without killing Dr. Threat. Incorporate that means into their goal because they think that it is morally important not to kill others. The problem here is if we think of games as just incorporating the means into the ends, that this would give the wrong result. It would say that I'm just playing a game when I try to save Professor Snooze without killing Dr. Threat. But it doesn't look like that person is playing a game in that kind of scenario. Now, Suits responds by saying, well, look, this does show that sometimes people aren't playing a game, even though they're incorporating means into their ends. In other words, incorporating means into ends isn't sufficient to make something a game. However, all of that's consistent with the idea that all games still incorporate their means into their ends. In other words, maybe this feature of incorporating means into ends is still necessary for something being a game. So we have part of the idea of a game, just not all of it. We just need to add some further condition. Now, Suits gives the following condition to add on. He says, in games, I obey the rules just because such obedience is a necessary condition for my engaging in the activity such obedience makes possible. What makes something a game depends on the reason you have for incorporating those means into the end. If the reason you're saying, I'm going to follow this rule, I'm going to take this path, this means rather than another, if the reason for doing that is just because you want to engage in that kind of activity of following those rules, then it's a game. But if you have some other reason for incorporating the means into the ends, it's not a game. Game rules limit the available means just because it makes it possible to play the game, basically. As opposed to other cases, sometimes you limit the means you're willing to take to achieve that goal, not because you just want to engage in that activity, but you limit the means you're willing to take because you think it's wrong to take those means. It's wrong to kill. So Suits then goes on to give his definition and explain his definition, and at the end, he tries to make it more concise and give a portable version of it. This portable definition says playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. But you need to be careful here, because oftentimes people quote this portable definition, and they say it's vague and ambiguous, and that's because they ignore everything else Suits does. This isn't meant to be the full definition. This is just meant to be something that summarizes the idea. And so this goes into Suits' full definition. You are playing a game when you're engaging in some kind of activity. Now, what makes that activity a game? Well, it's when that activity is trying to accomplish some goal, some state of affairs, like crossing a finish line, for instance, in a race. But it's trying to accomplish that goal using only means that are permitted by certain rules, the rules of the game, where those rules say that you can't use the most efficient way to accomplish that goal. If the finish line is across a field, for instance, well, the rules say you have to stay on the track and you're not allowed to go across the field. The rules prohibit that more efficient way, that quicker way to get to the finish line. And where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such an activity. So the idea is you're playing a game when you accept that rule of not cutting across the field simply because you want to engage in the activity of racing, for instance. There's various aspects of this definition. First of all, there are different kinds of goals. There's what Suits calls a prelusory goal and a lusory goal. We'll talk about those in a bit. There are the rules of the game and the means by which you can accomplish a goal. The means that are allowed by the rules and the means that are not allowed by the rules. And then there's a lusory attitude. So the attitude that a person takes. So the reasoning behind why they commit themselves to following those rules. Is it because they just want to engage in the activity that those rules make possible, such as racing? Or are they following those rules? Are they committing themselves to those rules because they think it would be immoral to break those rules? Well, if so, then they're not engaging in a game. So let's talk about each of these aspects of the definition. There are these goals. First of all, there's the prelusory goal. So think lusory, just think game, coming from Latin ludic, which means play or game. Prelusory, think before the game. So this kind of goal is a goal that we can describe outside of the game itself. The lusory goal, on the other hand, the game goal, you might say, is a goal that incorporates the means permitted by the rules. And so we can only actually explain what this goal is by referring specifically to the rules. We cannot explain what this goal is without making essential reference to the rules of the game itself. Next, we have the rules. First, there are constitutive rules. These are the rules that help to define the game, help to define the activity. So these specify the means of achieving the goal that are forbidden. And these rules will then forbid the most efficient way of achieving that goal, and thereby allow some less efficient means. So those less efficient means that are allowed by the rules, you could call those the lusory means. The lusory attitude is a person's acceptance of constitutive rules just so that they can participate in the activity that they make possible. So this distinguishes the limitations on means that define games from those that come from morality, safety, or bureaucracy. That is, you might limit the means you're willing to use to accomplish a goal because you think those means are immoral. So you might say, I want to accomplish this, but I'm not going to kill someone to accomplish that because killing is wrong. Well, now you're not accepting that limitation because it helps make some activity possible. You're accepting that limitation because you think it's immoral to break that. So now, revisiting that full definition. To play a game is to engage in an activity directed towards bringing about a specific state of affairs. So, directed towards some prelusory goal. Using only means permitted by the rules. So these are the illusory means. They're what we're allowed to do by the rules, where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means. So these are the constitutive rules, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such an activity. That's the illusory rule. The reason you choose to follow those rules is in order to engage in the activity that these rules make possible. Remember, Wittgenstein brought up this idea that, look, maybe you want to say that the one thing that all games have in common is that they're amusing or enjoyable. He says, but that's not really a similarity that can be used to define games. But it does seem like there's something important here, because one reason we do play games is because we enjoy them. And so one thing we might want from a definition of games is to try to explain how playing a game would cause enjoyment, all right, would cause pleasure, why we would value or care about playing games, why we would want to play games. Now, this definition, I think, can explain a lot of why we enjoy or value games. And it might have implications for how we try to understand the difference between a good game and a bad game. The lines drawn in games are not really arbitrary at all. So basically, the rules you make up in a game that say you can use these means, but you can't use these means to achieve the pre-illusory goal. He said, well, look, those lines are not actually arbitrary. For both that the lines are drawn and also where they are drawn have important consequences, not only for the type, but where you draw the lines is also important for the quality of the game to be played. The game wright must avoid two extremes. If he draws his lines too loosely, the game will be too dull because winning will be too easy. If you allow too much in a game, you'll just make it too easy to win, and it won't be interesting, won't be fun, won't be enjoying. On the other hand, rules are lines that can be drawn too tightly so that the game becomes too difficult. If the rules end up making it just so incredibly difficult to win that it's almost impossible, well, that's not going to be any fun. What you want to do is make it possible for someone to actually achieve the pre-illusory goal, but also keep it challenging and not too easy. The idea is we enjoy that struggle. We enjoy taking on that challenge. That's part of why we engage in playing games. And so we want the rules to create the right amount of challenge, not too little, not too much. All right, so now let's consider some examples here. A very famous game, golf. First of all, there's a pre-illusory goal. So remember, this is the goal you can describe without making reference to the game itself. Here we can describe the pre-illusory goal as just get the ball into the hole. But then we have the illusory means and the illusory goals. So the illusory means hitting the ball with a golf club and not carrying it up with one's hands. The illusory goal is getting the ball into the hole using only golf strokes. So notice this illusory goal makes reference to the idea of a golf stroke. But you can't understand what a golf stroke is without understanding the rules of golf. All right? Picking up the ball and chucking it, that goes against the rules, and so that's not a golf stroke. And so this goal can only be understood in reference to the actual rules of the game. Now, also, illusory goal of golf is just winning golf. But what it means to win golf can't be understood without reference to the rules of golf. That brings us to the rules. You can hit the ball with a golf club. Each hit with a club counts as one stroke. You must start your first stroke at the tee-off location. You can't start right next to the hole. You cannot carry the ball with your hand. And then there's a whole bunch more rules of golf. Honestly, I don't know all the rules of golf because I don't play golf very often. And there's also this illusory attitude. That is, the person accepts the restrictions of means specified by the rules just because doing so makes it possible for them to engage in that activity of trying to put the ball in the hole in as few golf strokes as they can. That is, they don't accept these rules because there's anything immoral about picking up a ball and dropping it in a hole. They accept these rules just because they make the activity of golf possible. Or consider this example, Candyland. So this is a children's board game where you try to get to the end of the board. So Candyland, the pre-illusory goal is to get your figure to the spot at the end of the track before other players. But now there's illusory means and illusory goals. The illusory means moving your figure to the next colored location that matches the color of the card you drew. So you draw a card, you look at the color, well, it's red, so find the next red on that track and move your piece there. The rules don't allow you to just pick up your piece and put it at the end of the track. That would be a much more efficient way to get your figure to the end of the track before other players. The rules, however, limit the means you can use. It says you can't do that. You have to move your figure in this way. The illusory goal is to win Candyland. Winning Candyland is not just getting your figure to the end of the track before other players, it's getting your figure to the end of the track while following the rules of Candyland. So I can't understand what it is to win Candyland without reference to the game itself. Then there's the rules of Candyland. You can only move on your turn, so you have to take turns. You can only draw one card, then do that. You can't just pick up your piece and move it to the end of the track. You must start at the location labeled Start. You must draw your movement card randomly. You cannot choose which movement card you want to use this round. So you can't just like go through the cards, find the color you want, and be like, oh, this one will get me the farthest, so I'm going to use that one. The illusory attitude. Yet again, the person accepts the restrictions of means specified by the rules just because doing so makes it possible for them to engage in this activity of pursuing the goal of winning Candyland. Now, in this case, look, Candyland is not a particularly fun or enjoyable game. I don't think it's a particularly good game, but it does seem to meet this definition given by Suits. And I might say the reason it's a bad game is because it just makes it so easy. I just draw a card, move it. Like, there's nothing really challenging there. This is very much a game of luck, so to speak. It's just a luck of the draw. And so in that extent, I'm not really challenging myself. I'm not really struggling to achieve that goal. And if that's really what we want, is the challenge of trying to accomplish a goal using means that are enjoyable, well, that might explain why this game is not a particularly good game. All right, so that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.